Hello there. Welcome to Sleepy Factory. Before we begin our quiet journey tonight, you might notice gentle bells woven between the chapters. When you hear them, take a deep breath in and let it go slowly. Feel your body soften, your shoulders, your hands, even your heartbeat. The sound of the bell is a small reminder that you can rest here, just like the ancient words resting on the shelves of time. Now, close your eyes if you wish, and let's step softly into the whispering world of ancient libraries. The first writing was not made to be read, it was made to be remembered. Long before ink met paper, before words were pressed into the patient surface of the world, people carried memory in their lungs. They told it to the fire and to the river. They carved it into each other's hearing. Every story was a breath that had to keep moving or vanish. To forget was to let the wind die. Then, near a certain river that never stopped giving, the Nile began to whisper. Reeds grew tall where the water met the sun, their green stalks trembling in the heat. From them came a skin unlike any other, light, strong, born of water yet able to hold fire in the form of thought. The people called it papyrus. It was not invention so much as discovery, the moment the earth offered the human mind a body. They learned to cut the stalks and peel them into thin ribbons. They laid the strips side by side, then another layer across, pressed by stone, kissed by the weight of time. The sap glued them together. When the sun had baked the pages dry, they were polished smooth with shells until they caught the light like calm water. A sheet of papyrus shimmered slightly, as though the Nile itself still moved within it. Every step was ritual. To make papyrus was to invite the spirit of the river into stillness. It was patience turned into matter. The process itself could take days, sometimes weeks, depending on the thickness of the stalk and the steadiness of the hand. In each fiber, one could sense the discipline that ancient Egypt demanded of its scribes. Precision as devotion, order as worship. A poorly made sheet could break, but a perfect one could outlive empires. The first marks were not letters as we know them, but images, sacred shapes that tried to catch the essence of the thing described. A bird was drawn as a bird, a man as a man. Yet even as symbols, they were more than pictures. They were bridges. The ancient Egyptians believed that to write a name was to grant it life. Ink was not decoration. It was breath returned to silence. In those early rooms of learning, the Pergamon, the houses of life, scribes practiced the art of making thought visible. Their world smelled of lamp oil and crushed reed, of dust and burnt resin. They sharpened their reed pens with knives made from fishbone, dipped the nibs into black pigment from soot, and red pigment from ochre. The sound of writing was soft, a rhythm of touch rather than noise, stroke, lift, breathe. Each line followed a hidden pulse, like the heartbeat of Thoth, the god who invented writing and gave it to humankind. To be a scribe was to hold divine power. Children destined for the profession began training early, memorizing hundreds of signs before they were ever allowed to touch papyrus. They practiced on shards of pottery, on broken limestone, until their wrists learned obedience. Only then could they graduate to the smooth, precious sheets imported from the Delta. In the instructions of Katie, a text copied by students for centuries, a father advises his son, "Be a scribe. It saves you from labor. You are one who commands, not one who carries." Writing was not merely a job. It was a salvation from the body's weariness, a ticket into the realm of intellect and gods. The house of life attached to each temple served as both archive and sanctuary. Inside, priests and scribes copied hymns, medical treatises, astronomical charts, stories of kings and of creation. Some scrolls were stored in wooden chests painted with spells to protect against decay. Others were sealed in jars and buried with their owners, so that the knowledge might travel safely into eternity. The temple walls sometimes bore inscriptions describing these libraries, a place where the divine words are kept safe, guarded by the priest of writing, beloved of Thoth. Over centuries, the papyrus scroll became Egypt's bloodstream of memory. In Thebes and Memphis, in the hidden rooms of Karnak, the papyrus rustled softly when unrolled, releasing the scent of resin and centuries. The oldest surviving texts date back to around 3000 BCE. They speak of medicine, of heart and vessels, of the path of air through the body. The Ebers Papyrus, written about 1550 BCE, is a compendium of cures and incantations, a library within a single scroll, 20 meters long, describing diseases of the heart, skin, eyes, and spirit. To read it today is to hear the murmur of ancient doctors, balancing between faith and reason. Each line of hieroglyphs carried layers of meaning, the literal, the symbolic, the divine. Words were believed to act. To name a disease was to bind it. To write a prayer was to summon its power. In this world, the papyrus was not passive. It was an instrument of transformation. When an embalmer unrolled a copy of the Book of the Dead beside a mummy, the text was not simply recitation, but activation, a map for the soul's journey through the underworld. Every hieroglyph was a lamp lit along that path. Scribes lived between silence and sound. Their task was to listen to what the dead and the gods wanted written down. They kept records of grain and taxes, but also of dreams, omens, and royal decrees. Some served in palaces, some in temples, some traveled with the army to record victories. In their daily labor, they built the scaffolding of civilization. Without their ink, the names of pharaohs would dissolve like mist. The climate of Egypt, dry and forgiving, became the great librarian. Scrolls buried in tombs or left in desert storerooms endured for millennia. Unlike vellum or paper, papyrus thrived in aridity. Moisture was its only enemy. That is why so many of the oldest books of humanity come from sand. The desert, indifferent to time, became the guardian of memory. Imagine one such scroll lying hidden in the Valley of the Kings, brittle now, brown, the edges curled inward like ancient fingers. A beam of light touches it, and for a second the fibers gleam as they once did. The scribe who made it is dust, the ruler it praised is gone, yet the ink still whispers. You could unroll it, and find the same heartbeat that once guided his hand. In the folds of that papyrus, time has not passed, it has merely been folded. As Egypt traded with its neighbors, papyrus became one of the Nile's most precious exports. The Greeks, hungry for knowledge, bought it by the shipload. Philosophers in Athens wrote dialogues upon its surface. Merchants recorded accounts, poets inscribed their hymns. To write on papyrus was to borrow Egypt's immortality. Even the Romans, centuries later, used it for their imperial decrees. A papyrus bearing the signature of an emperor carried both law and myth. By the first millennium, BCE, papyrus scrolls circulated across the Mediterranean. In Byblos, whose name would later give birth to the word Bible, shipments of papyrus arrived from the Nile, packed in bales. Scribes in Phoenicia, in Crete, in Carthage, unrolled them like veins of gold. The world was building an invisible network, a trade route of thought, but the dependence on papyrus also made empires vulnerable. When Egypt restricted exports to protect its monopoly, other civilizations had to innovate. In the city of Pergamon, artisans began to treat animal skin with lime and stretch it taut to create parchment, a surface smoother, stronger, and more flexible than papyrus. That invention would eventually carry the scripts of the Middle Ages, but its birth was an act of necessity, born from the politics of paper. Still, papyrus remained the sacred ancestor. Even when newer materials emerged, its aura lingered. It had been the cradle of literacy, the stage upon which the human mind first learned to echo itself. The Greek historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, described the process in detail, noting that the best papyrus came from the heart of the plant, the thinnest layers reserved for sacred or royal use. Lower grades served for business documents. Even in bureaucracy, the reed of the Nile was king. To touch a papyrus scroll was to touch an entire system of belief. That words could preserve, that silence could be bound and stored. A single scroll could take months to prepare, copy, and decorate. Some were kept in wooden boxes wrapped in linen, labeled with clay tags. Others were stacked in pigeonhole shelves that lined the walls of libraries. The grandest of these, in time, would be Alexandria, the dream of a universal library, where every text ever written might live together like stars in one sky. But before Alexandria, there were the quieter rooms, the small sanctuaries where scribes bent under the flicker of oil lamps, breathing ink into eternity. They worked mostly at dawn or twilight, when the light was soft enough not to glare upon the fibers. Their left hands held the scroll open. Their right hands traced the hieroglyphs. Occasionally they paused, blew gently across the wet lines, then continued. The rhythm was monastic before monasteries existed. The word scriptorium had not yet been coined, yet the discipline was already there, the sacred loneliness of the copyist. If you listen closely in those rooms, you might hear the murmur of collaboration across centuries. One scribe copies a medical text written 200 years before his birth. Another adds commentary in the margin. Knowledge folds upon itself, an endless conversation where every voice is made of ink. Some scrolls were never meant to be read aloud. They were offerings, buried with the dead or sealed in temples. Others were practical, used daily until worn out and discarded into waste heaps. Ironically, those trash mounds would later become archaeological gold mines. In places like Oxyrhynchus, modern excavations have unearthed 500,000 fragments of papyrus, letters, receipts, poems, love notes, school exercises. They show that writing was not confined to priests and kings. It belonged also to ordinary people trying to fix their lives in words. A grocer listing debts, a mother writing to her son, a soldier asking for leave, all of them trusting papyrus to remember. That trust is the true miracle. Humans gave their thoughts to a plant, and the plant kept them. Even now, when scientists examine a surviving papyrus under a microscope, they can see the cellular lattice of the reed, the veins that once carried water. Those same channels now carry ink. It is as if the Nile still flows within the page, but instead of water it carries time. The sheet becomes a delta of meanings, fibers crossing fibers, stories crossing stories. To hold one is to feel the fragility of endurance. The fibers crackle softly, the edges flake away, yet something in it resists decay, a tension between dust and idea. Perhaps that is what civilization really is, the stubbornness of thought against the entropy of matter. When the modern reader stands in a museum and peers through the glass at an ancient papyrus, what they see is not merely a text, but a negotiation between mortality and memory. The handwriting is uneven, the symbols sometimes faded, Yet the gesture remains clear, the human wish to leave behind a trace fine enough to outlast the flesh. Each loop of the pen says, I was here, I saw, I thought. The papyrus replies, you still are. Somewhere deep inside the Egyptian night, a single flame trembles above a scroll. A scribe dips his pen again, ink glistening like oil on water. Outside, the river murmurs, the stars hold their quiet positions, and the moonlight leaks through the lattice of the window. The papyrus in front of him is warm from his hands. He writes the name of a king who believes his reign will last forever. The scribe knows better. He has seen the dust gather on other names. Still, he writes, because that is what he was born to do, keep the illusion of permanence alive long enough to reach the next dawn. The act of writing, in that world, was never purely practical. It was spiritual labor. The Egyptians imagined the heart as a recorder of deeds, to be weighed against the feather of truth in the afterlife. The scribe mirrored that cosmic balance. Every line of text was an attempt to weigh thought itself. If words leaned too far into chaos, the world tilted. If they remained true, order, Mot, endured. Papyrus became the vessel of Mot. It was as sacred as the stones of the temples, yet infinitely more delicate. To preserve knowledge on something so fragile was to accept the impermanence of all things, and still choose to write anyway. The strength of papyrus lay not in its durability, but in its surrender. It aged, yellowed, split, but even in decay it offered wisdom. Look, it seemed to say, I too am mortal, and yet I remember. By the New Kingdom period, the production of papyrus had become a complex industry. Entire families in the Nile Delta devoted their lives to harvesting, cutting, and pressing the reeds. Workshops near Memphis exported rolls to foreign merchants. The trade reached as far as Babylon and Rome. In bustling markets, traders unrolled sheets before the buyers, thin as petals, light as breath. Some scrolls were so fine they could be rolled around a finger. Others were rougher, made for lists, ledgers, and letters. Each carried the scent of the river and the hand of its maker. The papyrus industry shaped Egypt's economy, but it also shaped its sense of self. The kingdom's bureaucracy relied on it. Taxes, inventories, laws, treaties, all written in ink that bound men more tightly than rope. On papyrus, the first concept of a contract was born, the first census, the first archive. The written word gave permanence to governance. Without papyrus, there would have been no empire to remember. Over time, papyrus scrolls grew longer and more intricate. Some were joined end to end until they stretched several meters, their texts continuing seamlessly across folds. Others were small enough to fit in a pocket, carried by travelers or soldiers. Scholars estimate that a single scribe could copy an average of 3 to 5 columns of hieroglyphs per day, depending on complexity. It was slow work, deliberate and meditative. To rush would dishonor both the craft and the gods. Not every scroll survived the centuries. Many were lost to fire, flood, or neglect. In Alexandria, when Julius Caesar's troops set ships ablaze in 48 BCE, thousands of papyrus manuscripts are said to have perished in the flames. Whether the entire library burned or only parts of it remains debated, but the image endures, shelves collapsing into smoke, ink turning to ash, the collective memory of humanity scattering upward like black snow. The tragedy of Alexandria became a parable, the reminder that knowledge is as flammable as faith. And yet, even as empires fell, the papyrus plant kept growing. Year after year, it returned to the riverbanks, its roots deep in the silt. The Nile renewed it, as the Nile renews everything. Monks in later centuries would still use its stems for baskets, sandals, ropes. Its paper-making secret faded into legend, rediscovered only by modern scholars. In that forgetting and rediscovery, one hears the rhythm of civilization itself, learning, loss, and return. When archaeologists in the 19th century unearthed the first intact papyrus scrolls, the reaction bordered on reverence. They found the texture astonishingly smooth, the fibers still interlaced with visible care. Some fragments even retained traces of red and black ink, the pigments bright as if written yesterday. The Greek word papyros had survived, passing into Latin as papyrus, then into French and English as paper. The reed of the Nile had quietly renamed the foundation of human communication. Every sheet of modern paper is, in spirit, a descendant of that first experiment along the river. To imagine the world before writing is to imagine a world without continuity. Each generation began anew, its wisdom dissolving with the breath that spoke it. Writing, and papyrus in particular, changed the direction of time. For the first time, the past could be held in the present. A thought could outlive its thinker. Humanity built not only pyramids of stone, but pyramids of meaning. The ancient Egyptians saw eternity not as endless future, but as the ability to return, to be recalled. In that sense, every surviving papyrus is a resurrection. The medical scrolls, the hymns to Ra, the mathematical problems written in columns, they all breathe again each time they're read. One of the most haunting examples is the Rend mathematical papyrus from around 1650 BCE, containing 84 problems and their solutions. Its author, the scribe Ahmes, begins with humility. This book was copied accurately from old writings in the time of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. He does not claim invention, only continuation. That humility is the essence of scribal wisdom. The understanding that to preserve is to participate in something larger than oneself. The same spirit appears in the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells intended to guide the soul through the afterlife. Each papyrus was custom-made for its owner, with the deceased's name inserted into the text. In tombs, the scrolls were placed beside the mummy, often wrapped in linen or tucked under an arm. The pages were not meant to be read by the living, but by the soul as it awakened in darkness. The papyrus became both map and companion. Even in death, the written word remained the most faithful of friends. Today, when we look at these scrolls behind glass, they seem impossibly fragile, brown, frayed, barely holding together. But that fragility hides an inner strength. A papyrus can survive 3,000 years because it was made to breathe. Its fibers expand and contract with humidity, like lungs inhaling and exhaling across centuries. The writing upon it is an exhalation caught midair. Museums often keep the rooms dim to protect the ink from fading. The visitor approaches, peers down, and sees lines of ancient handwriting so fine they look almost alive. The black ink is carbon. The red is iron oxide. The letters are not printed but drawn, each stroke a decision. Sometimes, if you stand quietly, you can sense the presence of the scribe behind the glass, his concentration hanging in the air like incense. His heartbeat is the metronome of civilization. The papyrus does not shout, it hums. Its silence is its speech. That is why, even after all this time, we listen. In modern laboratories, conservators use microscopes to study the fibers. They analyze the ratio of cellulose to lignin, measure the width of the layers, identify the source of pigments. Some use infrared imaging to recover text invisible to the naked eye, ghost words, returning after millennia of darkness. These discoveries continue to rewrite history. A fragment once thought meaningless can reveal a lost poem of Sappho or a forgotten decree of a pharaoh. The papyrus, patient as stone, releases its secrets only to those who still know how to listen. In that way, the ancient and the modern mind meet. Both are curious, both are fragile, both want to make silence speak. There is a kind of kindness in the persistence of papyrus. It reminds us that the things we make with care outlast us, not because they are immortal, but because they decay slowly enough for someone else to find them. The papyrus accepts its own fading. That is what allows it to endure. At night, in the conservation rooms of museums, the temperature is controlled, the lights dimmed, the scrolls rest under glass, asleep. Somewhere a guard walks by, his footsteps soft. The air hums faintly with machines that regulate humidity. And on the table, under layers of preservation film, lies the voice of a civilization, still breathing through the dust. What survives of Egypt's words is uneven. Much was lost, but enough remains to outline the shape of a mind that once looked at the stars and saw order. The papyrus was the mirror that mind built for itself. The stars are gone from its surface now, replaced by our own reflections as we lean closer to read. Somewhere, perhaps a child in Memphis or Alexandria once watched his teacher open a scroll and felt a tremor of awe. That same tremor moves through anyone who reads today. For though languages have changed, the gesture has not. A hand unrolling a page, eyes moving along lines of ink, a thought crossing the narrow bridge from the dead to the living. The bridge still holds. Papyrus taught humanity the art of endurance through softness, the balance of letting go and holding on. It proved that memory does not need hardness to survive, only devotion. Its invention was not the beginning of technology. It was the beginning of tenderness, the same tenderness that still guides every librarian who lifts a brittle sheet under the hum of modern light. When the first Europeans rediscovered papyrus in the sands of Egypt, they saw it as a relic of a lost world. They could not yet imagine that this plant had shaped their own. The word Bible, the word paper, the word publish, all carry echoes of that reed. Every page ever printed, every book ever bound, traces its ancestry to the swampy deltas of the Nile. Each time a writer fills a page, they reenact an ancient rite, turning breath into mark, transience into trace. That is the quiet lineage of writing, a lineage older than iron, older than cities, as old as the will to be remembered. The papyrus never demanded worship, yet it received it. Priests wrapped scrolls in linen, scholars stored them in chests with amulets to keep away insects and rot. In the imagination of Egypt, words were alive, capable of both blessing and harm. To write was to create, to erase was to kill. This sacred caution lingers in the modern phrase, dead language. But languages do not die. They sleep like papyrus beneath sand, waiting for a warm hand to unroll them again. Centuries passed. The Nile changed its course, empires shifted their borders, but the reed still grew. Its stalks rose where the soil remembered water. Travelers wrote that they could hear the wind through papyrus fields sounding like whispers, thin, endless whispers. Perhaps those were the voices of the old scribes, reminding the living that memory is never entirely human. It belongs to the materials we entrust it to. When the Greeks settled in Egypt after Alexander's conquest, they brought their alphabet and their thirst for cataloging. They built new libraries alongside the temples, rooms filled with scrolls copied from every corner of the known world. Papyrus was their medium, the Nile their supplier. The Library of Alexandria, begun under Ptolemy I around 300 BCE, was the culmination of this dream, a place where the written thoughts of all peoples could dwell together, safe from oblivion. Imagine walking its halls. The light falls through high windows, filtered by curtains of linen. Rows of papyrus scrolls lie stacked in niches, each labeled with a clay tag. Scribes move silently between them, carrying new copies from the copying rooms. The air smells of cedar oil and sea salt, the perfume of preservation. Outside, the harbor murmurs with ships bringing more cargo. Scrolls from Athens, from Persia, from India. Inside, the empire of thought expands. To those who served there, Alexandria was more than a library. It was a living organism, a heartbeat of civilization. Every scroll copied there was an act of faith, that humanity's knowledge could be gathered and guarded. That faith, of course, was fragile. Fires, wars, decrees, all could undo it. But the idea endured, long after the building itself turned to legend. The papyrus made the idea tangible, shelves of silence that contained all possible voices. The destruction of Alexandria, however partial or complete, marked not the end but the beginning of our awareness of loss. From that moment forward, every library carried a shadow of that fire. The lesson was simple and terrible. Knowledge must be tended like a flame, not hoarded like treasure. A single spark can erase centuries, yet the human instinct is not to despair. It is to copy again, to rebuild, to reinscribe. And so the work continued. In Hellenistic Egypt, in Rome, in Byzantium, scribes unrolled papyrus and filled it once more with ink. The technology spread westward, carried by trade and conquest. In the first centuries, CE, papyrus scrolls became the standard form of book across the Mediterranean. The Christian Gospels were first written on papyrus, their words of salvation following the same path as the hymns to Ra and the spells of Osiris. The material outlived the gods it once served. Over time, a new shape appeared, the Codex, a book made of folded sheets bound along one edge. Papyrus could be cut and stacked, but its stiffness limited how many pages could be bound together. The innovation marked a transition from the rolling river of the scroll to the still pond of the book. Parchment would soon replace papyrus entirely, but the change was gradual, gentle, almost tender. For centuries, the two materials coexisted, as if the old and new worlds were exchanging farewells. Still, even in decline, papyrus carried prestige. In official correspondence of the late Roman Empire, emperors demanded their edicts be written on Egyptian sheets, not on inferior substitutes. The name papyrus became synonymous with authority. To this day, bureaucracies still echo that heritage when they speak of paperwork. Eventually, the papyrus fields of the Nile fell silent. Trade routes shifted, production waned, and by the 11th century, papyrus as a writing material had vanished from common use. But the plan itself did not die. It merely returned to being what it had always been, a reed swaying by the water, waiting. Modern Egypt still grows it as an ornament, its stalks rising tall and proud. Tourists buy small handmade sheets from local artisans, unaware that they hold in their hands a resurrection. To stand in one of those workshops today is to feel time folding back on itself. The process has hardly changed. The cutting, the soaking, the pressing. The workers hum softly as they align the strips, layer upon layer, just as their ancestors did 5,000 years ago. When they lift the finished sheet into the light, it glows amber, veined like skin. It is not imitation, it is continuity. In museums, scholars handle ancient papyri with tweezers and breath masks. their hands trembling with both fear and awe. They scan each fiber, each stroke of ink. They publish facsimiles online so the world can read what the Nile wrote. But the digital copy, for all its clarity, cannot replace the physical presence, the faint rustle, the smell of age, the warmth of a page that once lay beneath a living hand. The papyrus speaks to something older than technology. It speaks to our need to touch meaning. A screen glows, a papyrus absorbs light. One dazzles, the other listens. In that difference lies the soul of reading. If the modern library is a cathedral of servers and screens, then papyrus is its relic, the bone of the first saint of writing. And like all relics, it asks not for use but for reverence. It reminds us that progress is not only invention, but also remembrance. We carry the past forward not by repeating it, but by understanding its patience. Consider what the scribes achieved. Not machines, not armies, but endurance through tenderness. They turned the stalks of a river plant into the first fabric of consciousness. They learned to compress eternity into a roll that could be held under an arm. Every time they unrolled a scroll, they extended the horizon of what it meant to be human. They taught us that knowledge is not noise, but rhythm, a slow pulse written down. And what of us, who live surrounded by words and data? We are heirs to their craft, though we rarely sense it. When we jot down a note, type a message, sign a document, we are repeating their gesture to fix the fleeting. The tools have changed, but the hunger is the same. We still long to make the invisible visible, to keep something of ourselves from dissolving into time. The papyrus understood that longing. It carried the first poems, the first laws, the first love letters. It taught humanity how to listen to itself. Even its fragility was instruction. That memory, like a plant, needs care and context. It cannot grow in darkness or neglect. It thrives only when we return to it again and again with gentle hands. Somewhere in a desert cave, there may still lie an undiscovered scroll, sealed in linen, waiting. When the archaeologist's brush lifts the dust, the reed fibers will catch the sun once more. The ink will gleam. The words will return to the air after thousands of years of silence. That moment, the meeting of two breaths across time, is the essence of civilization. To imagine it is to feel both small and infinite. The papyrus does not promise eternity. It simply offers the possibility of return. And perhaps that is enough. For every human life is a kind of papyrus, fragile, handmade, layered with memory, written upon by both accident and intention. We are pressed together by time, smoothed by experience, inscribed by joy and loss. We fade, we tear, yet some trace of us remains in the hands of those who come after. The world itself is a scroll still being written, unrolled slowly by the wind. Listen closely, and you can almost hear it, the whisper of fibers rubbing softly against each other, the sigh of a page turning somewhere beyond sight. That is the sound of papyrus still breathing, the sound of history inhaling. And as long as that sound continues, we will know that nothing written with care is ever truly lost. The dawn over Alexandria was not a sunrise, but a revelation. Light spilled from the sea like ink poured backward, filling the sky with the pale gold of papyrus. Ships rocked gently in the harbor, their sails folded like sleeping wings. The air carried the mingled scent of salt, cedar, and ink, a perfume of ambition. Somewhere beyond the docks, between the murmurs of traders and the cries of gulls, a dream was being built out of stone and thought. The Library of Alexandria was never meant to be just a building. It was a statement, a declaration that the human mind could be mapped and contained, that knowledge could be gathered like harvest. Around 300 BCE, under Ptolemy the Soter, successor to Alexander the Great, this dream took root. The king, once a general, had conquered lands and seen empires crumble. Now he sought to conquer time itself. What he could not rule with armies, he would preserve with ink. His vision was guided by Demetrius of Phalerum, a philosopher exiled from Athens, a man who had tasted both power and the silence that follows its loss. It was Demetrius who conceived of the library, not as a mere collection, but as a cosmos in miniature. Every book a star, every scroll a fragment of creation's memory. They called the institution the Musion, the Temple of the Muses. It was a sanctuary for divine inspiration, a place where words could dwell safely beside gods. The Musion stood near the royal palace, within the Bruchion quarter of Alexandria. Its halls were long, lined with columns carved from white limestone. Sunlight fell in narrow bands through clear story windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like ancient thoughts. Scholars walked those corridors wrapped in linen robes, their sandals whispering against the marble. Some carried tablets, others scrolls bound in linen and sealed with wax. The sound of turning papyrus became the heartbeat of the city. Here, knowledge was not hoarded, but cultivated. The library's mission was total, to collect every text in the known world. Ships entering the harbor were searched by royal decree. Any manuscripts found aboard were seized, copied by scribes, and then returned, or sometimes not returned at all. The originals stayed in Alexandria, and the copies went back to sea. Over decades, the collection grew into hundreds of thousands of scrolls. No one knew the exact number. Some said 400,000, others 700,000. The truth is less important than the intention, the audacity to believe that the universe could be written down. The scholars who lived and worked there were not monks, but courtiers of intellect. They received stipends from the crown, lodging, and meals within the Musion. They studied astronomy, medicine, mathematics, music, and philosophy. Among them walked men whose names still echo. Euclid, who drew the geometry of reason. Eratosthenes, who measured the earth with nothing but shadows and patience. Callimachus, who devised the first known catalog, a system of classification that turned chaos into order. His work, the Pinakes, listed authors, titles, and subjects, an index of human curiosity. To walk through that library must have been to feel the pulse of the world itself. Scrolls in Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Persian, Sanskrit, all languages of the known world, rested beside each other like neighbors. The air was thick with the murmur of translation. Scribes bent over tables copying texts brought from as far as India, while philosophers debated the movement of planets or the ethics of kings. The smell of lamp oil and papyrus filled the halls, a constant incense of concentration. It was in Alexandria that the line between science and myth began to blur, not because scholars were confused, but because they refused to see separation. To them, knowledge was a single ocean. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and theology were merely different waves reflecting the same light. The city's lighthouse, the Pharos, was both a marvel of engineering and a symbol of this new faith. That illumination could be built, that light could be summoned at will. Outside, the city thrived on commerce and empire. Inside, another empire expanded quietly, one made of words. The librarians were cartographers of meaning, mapping continents of thought. They studied not only what text said, but how they said it, comparing versions, correcting errors, arguing over the placement of commas in Homer's verses. The great critic Aristarchus of Samothrace spent decades editing the Iliad and Odyssey, convinced that perfection lay in precision. For him, every accent mark mattered, because language itself was divine. To read in Alexandria was to enter communion. The scroll unrolled across the table like a path. The eyes followed it slowly, right to left, line by line, as though retracing the steps of creation. The scholar's hand hovered near the margins, sometimes adding a note, sometimes pausing as if listening to something beyond the words. And perhaps they were, for the Mauseon was not only a library, but a monastery of sound. Music filled its gardens, debates filled its courtyards, laughter echoed in its lecture halls. The muses were never silent. Visitors from distant lands came seeking wisdom, and many stayed. The Jewish philosopher Aristobulus translated Hebrew scripture into Greek. Physicians dissected animals to study anatomy. Astronomers charted the stars from the observatory's terrace. The spirit of inquiry that would later define the scientific method was born here, not as a set of rules, but as a mood, patient, reverent, fearless. And yet, beneath all the brilliance, a shadow always lingered, the awareness that knowledge, once gathered, must also be defended. Fire, envy, and politics were its eternal enemies. The library depended on royal favor, and kings changed their minds as easily as winds shift at sea. Still, the scribes copied, the thinkers thought, the poets wrote. They believed that by preserving the world's words, they could postpone oblivion. Imagine a day within its walls. Morning light falls upon the courtyard fountains. A mathematician demonstrates the curve of a parabola with a stick and a basin of water. In a nearby hall, a physician mixes herbs while quoting from the Eber's papyrus. Down another corridor, a young student recites Homer under his breath, his voice trembling but clear. Somewhere, a philosopher writes, "All things are numbers." Another replies, "All things are love." And in the middle of it all, the librarian moves like a quiet god, tending the shelves of creation. In the afternoons, when the sun turned the harbor white, the scholars would walk among the gardens. Fig trees shaded the pathways. In the distance, the lighthouse gleamed like a second sun. They would discuss philosophy beneath pergolas of vines. One might quote Aristotle, another would counter with Zoroaster or the wisdom of Egyptian priests. Ideas met and merged like rivers joining the sea. The world had never been so connected, so awake. At night, the library did not sleep. The lamplight shimmered against the scrolls. Somewhere, a poet scribbled lines that would outlive him by centuries. Somewhere else, a scholar quietly discovered that the Earth's circumference was 40,000 kilometers, close enough to truth to make the gods smile. Eratosthenes achieved this by measuring the angle of shadows in two cities, Siena and Alexandria, and using simple geometry to infer the planet's size. His calculation was not only accurate, it was beautiful, proof that observation and imagination could dance. Alexandria itself was a city of paradoxes. It was Greek and Egyptian, royal and mercantile, pagan and scientific. In its streets, one could buy spices from India, scrolls from Athens, and wisdom from priests. The library reflected this complexity. It was both temple and workshop, shrine and experiment. Its scholars sought to harmonize the fragments of humanity into one coherent melody. They believed that if all voices could be heard together, the dissonance of ignorance might fade. But harmony is fragile. Even as knowledge expanded, so did jealousy. Other cities envied Alexandria's intellectual power. Pergamon competed by building its own library, boasting of parchment scrolls finer than papyrus. Rome, too, grew hungry for cultural authority. And within Egypt, priests wary of foreign ideas muttered that too much light blinds the eyes. The seed of ruin was sown not in ignorance, but in pride. Still, for a few radiant centuries, the Mouseion held. It weathered wars, coups, and dynastic intrigues. Scholars came and went, generations passing like waves. Each left behind a mark, a treatise, a theory, a translation. Together they created something larger than any one empire, a memory of what it means to seek. And in that memory, Alexandria endures. The dream of Alexandria was too bright to last. All golden ages, like flames, are made of the same material as their own smoke. It began, as endings often do, with war. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, drawn by politics and passion. The city was divided by civil conflict between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy III. Caesar, besieged near the palace, ordered the ships in the harbor to be burned to block his enemy's advance. The fire spread beyond the docks, carried by the wind toward the Brucheion. The papyrus that had once captured light now fed it. No one can say with certainty how much was lost. Ancient writers disagree. Some claimed only the warehouse of scrolls. By the harbor burned, others that the flames devoured the great library itself. But the image endures, the shelves collapsing, the scrolls curling inward as though trying to shield their secrets, the ink turning to vapor. In that moment, Alexandria learned that knowledge is as flammable as faith, and just as dangerous. Yet even if the fire consumed part of it, the Mouseion did not die then. It rebuilt, reshaped, survived. There were secondary collections. The Serapeum, a temple complex dedicated to the syncretic god Serapis, held thousands more scrolls. The scholars continued their work. For another 300 years, Alexandria remained a beacon, but the flames had left a scar, a memory of fragility. Every scholar afterward lived with the echo of loss. The city evolved. It became Roman, then Byzantine. Its streets filled with new tongues, Latin, Coptic, Aramaic. The air thickened with the smell of incense instead of papyrus dust. The philosophers still gathered, but their discussions turned from geometry to theology. In the same halls where Euclid once drew lines of reason, bishops now debated the nature of divinity. The pursuit of universal knowledge had become a different kind of faith. And yet, the library's spirit persisted. The method of cataloging invented by Callimachus survived in Roman archives. The mathematical works of Archimedes, the astronomical observations of Hipparchus, the geographical maps of Eratosthenes, all continued to shape thought across the Mediterranean. The physical scrolls might have perished, but the ideas, like spores, had already drifted elsewhere, taking root in minds across generations. Still, the silence that followed the flames grew louder with time. What had once been the empire of the Muses turned into a whisper of memory. The scrolls that survived were scattered. Some found refuge in Constantinople, others carried east by scholars fleeing the tides of conquest. The rest turned to dust. The Library of Alexandria became not just a place but a symbol of how much can vanish and how much must always be built again. Later visitors tried to imagine what it had been like. Roman travelers described vast halls lined with shelves, clerks copying manuscripts by candlelight, students chanting verses of Homer. But whether they recalled the living Mouseion or its ghost, no one could tell. The more people tried to remember, the more myth replaced fact. The library became an idea larger than any building, the dream of total memory, the unreachable archive of everything. For centuries, historians searched for its ruins. Excavations found fragments, columns, statues, inscriptions, but not the library itself. Perhaps it lies beneath modern Alexandria, under layers of city and sea. Or perhaps it was never a single place at all, but an organism that dissolved into the bloodstream of civilization. Even after the Roman era, Alexandria remained a crossroads of thought. The philosopher Hypatia, born in the 4th century CE, became its brightest surviving flame. The daughter of mathematician Theon, she taught geometry, astronomy, and philosophy in the same spirit that had once filled the Mouseion. Students came from across the empire to hear her. She was known for her clarity of thought, her serenity, and her refusal to yield to ignorance. To her pupils, she embodied the library itself, luminous, rational, vast. But the world around her was changing. The old gods were dying. Christianity was rising. Tolerance was thinning. In 415 CE, amid political and religious tension, Hypatia was murdered by a mob, dragged from her chariot, torn apart in a church. The act was not just a killing, it was a symbol. The last guardian of Alexandria's ancient wisdom had fallen. The Serapeum, where some remnants of the library might still have existed, was destroyed soon after. Stones and papyrus alike were ground into silence. The story of Hypatia is often told as tragedy, but it's also testament. Her name endured when her killers' names did not. Her writings were lost, but her memory became the ink that others wrote with. In her death, the spirit of the library transformed from an institution into an inheritance. In the centuries that followed, Arab scholars, inheritors of Greek thought, translated and preserved what fragments survived. Baghdad's house of wisdom was in many ways Alexandria reborn, a new sanctuary of study where texts from Greece, Persia, and India met again under one roof. Through them, the light of Alexandria flowed eastward, and centuries later, back west to Europe. Knowledge, like water, always finds another riverbed, but the image of the burning library never faded. It haunted painters, poets, and scientists. Voltaire wept over it. Carl Sagan mourned it. Even school children learned to speak its name with a kind of reverence. In that single metaphor, the library lost to flame, humanity recognizes its own mortality. Every book we write is an act of defiance against that fire. Every shelf we build is a small Alexandria rebuilt. Modern scholars debate how much of the story is myth, how much truth. The evidence is scattered, the accounts conflicting. But myth and history often serve the same master, memory. What matters is not the exact number of scrolls or the date of destruction, but the idea that there once existed a place where curiosity was sacred. The Library of Alexandria remains, in our collective mind, a temple that refuses to die. Even now, in the 21st century, a new library stands near the ancient site, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, completed in 2002. Its circular design resembles a rising sun tilted toward the sea. Inside, millions of volumes sit beneath a roof of glass that filters daylight into soft bands, recalling the old Mauseon's corridors. Laser-etched on the outer walls are letters from every known alphabet, an echo of the old ambition to embrace all languages. Visitors move quietly, as if in the presence of ghosts. The building is modern, but the feeling is ancient. When sunlight touches the floor, one can almost imagine it glinting on papyrus. And so the cycle continues: construction, destruction, resurrection. Alexandria teaches that knowledge is not a monument but a rhythm, something that breathes, burns, and returns. The papyrus taught humanity to remember. Alexandria taught humanity to organize memory into meaning. One gave us the page, the other the library. Together, they turned curiosity into civilization. In every digital archive, every database, every quiet room where a reader bends over a screen, there is a trace of that old light. The servers hum like the wind through reeds. The pixels shimmer like sun on the harbor. Alexandria has gone nowhere. It has merely changed its body. But imagine for a moment the original again. Night in the harbor. The lighthouse burning steady on Pharos Island. Scholars walking home from the Moussion, scrolls tucked under their arms. The sound of sandals on stone. The sea reflecting stars like a second sky. In one of those houses, a philosopher leans over his table, writing by the light of a small oil lamp. He pauses, dips his pen, and whispers, "Let there be memory." The wind over the Mediterranean still carries dust from those vanished scrolls. Somewhere in the rhythm of the waves, if you listen long enough, you can almost hear pages turning. Alexandria's library may have burned, but the ember never died. It scattered, embedding itself in every place where humans have gathered to think. The true legacy of the Moussion was not its architecture, nor even its collection, but its conviction. That knowledge belongs to everyone who dares to seek it. In its heyday, the library stood not only as a monument to intellect, but as an experiment in coexistence. Within its walls, Egyptians and Greeks, Jews and Persians, Syrians and Nubians worked side by side. Language differences became opportunities rather than barriers. Translation was not merely linguistic, it was spiritual. To translate was to listen with humility to another culture's soul. The scholars understood that truth had many dialects, and wisdom flourished in the spaces between them. That spirit survived the fall of Alexandria and traveled along the veins of civilization. It passed through the monastic libraries of Europe, the scriptoria of Ireland, the observatories of Damascus, the universities of Bologna and Cordoba. Each was, in its own way, a small Alexandria, a lamp kept lit against the surrounding dark. The chain of knowledge has always been fragile, yet it endures precisely because it keeps breaking. Every generation must mend it anew. What made the ancient library unique was not its scale, but its intimacy. The scholars lived within it. The scrolls were their companions. Knowledge was not distant or abstract. It shared their breath. They ate together, argued, laughed. They lived as if understanding itself were a form of love. Modern science inherited their rigor, but often forgot their tenderness. In Alexandria, intellect was inseparable from wonder. The astronomer who measured stars also wrote hymns. The mathematician who proved a theorem might pause to praise the muses. In that harmony, something sacred emerged, a belief that the universe could be known not by conquering it, but by listening to it. That belief is older than books and stronger than empires. It survived the fires, the invasions, the tides of forgetting. It lives each time a question is asked without fear. Even destruction has its uses. The burning of the library made humanity aware of its hunger for preservation. Without that loss, we might never have built the libraries that followed, nor cherish the words we have. Alexandria became a mirror of our own fragility. In mourning it, we learn how to protect what remains. The irony is gentle but profound. The library's physical absence made it immortal. Myths last longer than marble. The Moussion became not a location, but a direction, a compass pointing toward light. Every archive, every classroom, every notebook on a desk carries a trace of its DNA. When a child looks at the night sky and asks why the stars move, Alexandria stirs. When a scientist draws a curve on a board, or a poet scribbles in the margin of a page, the city breathes again. Even the modern world, humming with circuits and glass, is haunted by its ghost. The internet, vast and ungraspable, is a descendant of that same impulse, to gather all knowledge in one place, to make the invisible visible. But digital memory, like papyrus, is fragile. Hard drives corrode, links vanish, data burns in silence. The lesson of Alexandria whispers again. No amount of storage can replace the devotion of care. Knowledge lives not in machines, but in the curiosity that feeds them. To preserve is to love. The ancient librarians knew this. They dusted their scrolls daily, wrapped them in linen, stored them away from damp. Each gesture was a prayer. The same ritual continues in modern libraries, though the materials have changed. White gloves replace linen. Climate control replaces temple walls. But the reverence remains. Somewhere, a librarian turns a key in a quiet building at dawn, and the light falls on rows of books that stretch like the corridors of the Mousillon. The work begins again. Some say that Alexandria's library fell because it tried to know too much, that the gods grew jealous. Perhaps that is only myth, but myths are memory's camouflage. There is truth inside the parable. To collect all knowledge is to confront the limits of the human mind. The library was not destroyed by ignorance alone. It was undone by the weight of its own perfection. Yet perfection was never its true aim. It sought not completion, but connection, to make a network of thought that stretched beyond any single age or ruler. And that, astonishingly, it achieved. Every branch of learning that we trace today, mathematics, geography, astronomy, philosophy, owes something to the pages that once slept in those halls. The circumference of the earth, the map of the heavens, the pulse of the human heart, all were first recorded there, then copied, then carried outward. Alexandria's ashes fertilized the soil of every future library. Perhaps that is how all knowledge survives, by burning, by scattering, by being found again. The story of Alexandria is the story of regeneration. Each flame, each ruin, each rediscovery is part of a larger cycle. The slow respiration of civilization. What was lost in fire reappears in thought. What perishes in time resurrects in attention. There is a legend that some scrolls were saved, hidden in desert caves or carried east along trade routes. No one knows if it is true, but legends, like papyrus fibers, bind history together. They give texture to what we cannot prove. And sometimes belief itself is a form of preservation. Imagine then that somewhere beyond the dunes, under the drifting sand, a sealed jar still lies waiting. Inside, a roll of papyrus wrapped in linen, the ink faded but legible. Perhaps it contains a poem written by a nameless scribe, something small and human, a line about the sound of waves against the quay, or the way lamplight trembles on a friend's face. Not the knowledge of gods, but the tenderness of memory. The jar waits, patient as centuries. One day someone will find it. They will open it gently, hold the scroll to the light, and read. And for an instant, Alexandria will return. That is all libraries really do. They return the world to itself. They are not storehouses, but mirrors of longing. Each book, each scroll, each data set is a promise that no thought is ever truly alone. We build libraries the way birds build nests, instinctively, out of whatever materials we have, against the certainty of storms. In the end, the Library of Alexandria was never destroyed. It simply changed form. It moved into the hearts of those who read, who write, who remember. Its true walls are made of breath and patience. Its true shelves are the lines of thought that connect one mind to another. The flame that consumed it did not erase its light, it spread it. And so, whenever you open a book, or scroll through a screen, or whisper a question into the quiet of the night, you are standing once again on the shores of that harbor. The lighthouse glows in the distance. The waves strike stone. The air smells faintly of ink and salt. Somewhere behind you, a door opens, and the voices of the muses call softly through the dark. They are still here. They never left. They are waiting for you to read. In the shadow of Alexandria's fading glory, another city began to stir. North across the Aegean, where the land of Asia Minor folds into the sea, rose Pergamon, brilliant, disciplined, hungry. Its hills glimmered with marble and ambition. Where Alexandria had worshipped the reed and the river, Pergamon worshipped endurance. It built its wisdom not from water, but from skin. The story begins with rivalry. Egypt's Ptolemies, proud of their papyrus monopoly, sought to starve competitors of the sacred material. No papyrus was to leave the Nile without royal approval. To the kings of Pergamon, this was both insult and challenge. They had built a citadel of art and learning, and they refused to let their scholars' quills dry for want of reeds. So they turned to what they had in abundance, animals and ingenuity. Some say the idea came from an accident. A scribe, desperate for writing surface, stretched the hide of a goat until it was thin and smooth, then wrote upon it. Others say it was the priests of Athena, the city's guardian, who discovered the method through sacred experimentation. Whatever the truth, by the 2nd century BCE, Pergamon had perfected a new material, Pergamena charta, the parchment of Pergamon. It was stronger than papyrus, more flexible, capable of being folded into books rather than rolled into scrolls. Where papyrus crackled, parchment murmured. Its surface was supple, luminous, able to hold ink like a promise. To make it was a craft of patience. Hides soaked in lime, scraped with curved knives, stretched on frames until they sang in the wind. The artisans rubbed them with pumice and chalk, smoothing every pore. A well-made sheet gleamed softly, pale as moonlight on marble. The city prospered on this invention. The Attalid kings, patrons of learning, built their own library to rival Alexandria's. It stood on the Acropolis, beside the great altar of Zeus, a temple of thought set against a temple of gods. Its shelves, carved from cedar, held over 200,000 scrolls. In its courtyards, philosophers debated. In its scriptoria, scribes labored. The air smelled of lime, leather, and ink, a scent that would follow civilization for 2 millennia. To the scholars of Pergamon, writing was no longer just preservation, it was architecture. A page was a wall, a line of script, a column. They experimented with formats, binding sheets back to back, sewing them along one edge, creating what would later be called the Codex. This quiet innovation transformed reading. No longer did one unroll the past. One could flip through it, turn and return. Memory gained agility. Knowledge became portable. In the light of their workshops, parchment pages hung like sails catching the wind of thought. The sound of knives on skin was steady, rhythmic. Each stroke removed what was unnecessary. There was beauty in the discipline, the scribe and the artisan collaborating across breath. One prepared the flesh, the other clothed it with meaning. The city itself mirrored this craft. Pergamon rose tier upon tier, streets climbing toward the Acropolis. The library's colonnades opened onto terraces overlooking the plain. From there, one could see the silver ribbon of the Caicus River winding below. Travelers approaching from afar saw not just a fortress, but an idea built in stone, that the human mind, like the hill, could be carved upward toward light. Visitors described its grandeur with awe. Pausanias wrote of the altar's frieze, where gods battled giants, carved so vividly that veins seemed to pulse beneath marble skin. Inside the library, rows of scrolls gleamed like captive sunlight. Statues of philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, Theophrastus, stood between shelves, silent mentors of the living. And above the entrance, an inscription, medicine for the soul. To read there was to practice a kind of devotion. The hum of study filled the chambers like a prayer. Scholars compared texts, debated language, copied lost works. Many came from Alexandria itself, seeking refuge from political turmoil or royal envy. Knowledge migrated, like birds escaping fire, and found new nests on Pergamon's heights. The rivalry between the two libraries was fierce but fertile. Out of competition grew innovation. If papyrus had given birth to the written world, parchment gave it a body fit for survival. The codex form, easier to store and reference, would outlast empires. In its turning pages lay the beginnings of modern reading, the notion that thought could be revisited, rearranged, indexed. The act of knowledge became tactile. Pergamon's librarians cataloged their collection meticulously, following the Alexandrian model but adding refinements. They classified by author, subject, and genre, marking scrolls with small ivory tags. The catalog itself became a work of art, a labyrinth of references that mirrored the city's own steep streets. Callimachus's Pinakies had inspired them, but they extended his method into a philosophy. That order is the poetry of reason. The scholar's pursuits spanned all disciplines. In medicine, Galen, born in Pergamon around 129 CE, studied in the temple of Asclepius, the god of healing. Surrounded by votive offerings shaped like human limbs and organs, he observed anatomy with a poet's eye and a surgeon's precision. Later, in Rome, he would become the empire's most influential physician, his theories dominating Western medicine for over 1,000 years. Galen never forgot his home. He called Pergamon the nurse of my mind. When Galen described parchment, he spoke of it as if it were living flesh. He noted how its pores drank ink, how it flexed like muscle. For him, the page was not dead material, but a continuation of the body, the human will inscribed upon animal skin. His metaphor captured the essence of Pergamon's genius, turning mortality into memory. The making of parchment required intimacy with impermanence. The hides had to be cleaned of every trace of life, yet the craftsman could never forget that life had been there. The faint scent of lime could not fully erase the ghost of the creature. To write upon parchment was to acknowledge the cost of remembrance, the transformation of one form of life into another. The ancients did not hide from that truth. They honored it. They saw the page as sacred exchange. The animal gives its skin so that the human can preserve thought. In that paradox lies the strange tenderness of civilization. Knowledge is never free. It demands offerings. But the gift, once given, multiplies. A single parchment scroll could be copied hundreds of times, carrying a lineage of minds across centuries. Pergamon's library became a magnet for travelers. Its steps echoed with accents from Greece, Syria, and Egypt. Pilgrims to the temple of Asclepius often climbed further up to see the house of wisdom. The priests and scribes shared a belief that healing and learning were twin arts, one for the body, one for the spirit. Patients in the sanctuary would sleep among inscriptions of prayers, and scholars nearby would study those same words, seeking patterns in divine language. The city blurred the line between science and magic, reason and revelation. At night, the Acropolis glowed with torchlight. The wind carried faint murmurs of reading from open courtyards. Beyond the walls, the plain lay dark, sprinkled with fires from shepherds' camps. From the highest terrace, one could see constellations mirrored in the city's lamps, the human attempt to answer heaven with its own stars. In the 2nd century BCE, under Eumenes II, the library reached its height. He expanded its collection, commissioned new scriptoria, and welcomed philosophers from across the Hellenistic world. The city's architects built covered walkways to protect scholars from the sun. Fountains cooled the air. The empire of parchment had begun. And yet, like all empires, it would face a slow erosion of time. Wars came, rulers changed, ambitions shifted. Pergamon allied with Rome, then became its vassal. The great altar was dismantled piece by piece and carried away. The library's scrolls were said to have been transferred to Egypt as part of political tribute. Some say Mark Antony gifted them to Cleopatra to replenish what the Alexandrian fire had consumed. History bends under the weight of such stories. Whether true or not, they tell us what mattered. The idea that knowledge flows, that no library is ever truly alone. By the early centuries of the Common Era, parchment had spread across the world. In monasteries and cities alike, scribes embraced it as the new standard. It allowed writing on both sides. It resisted decay better than papyrus. The codex became the vessel of sacred texts, the Torah, the Gospels, the Quran. All would find their earliest durable homes upon animal skin. The divine had found a new page. Still, the memory of Pergamon lingered in every bound book, every vellum manuscript illuminated with gold. Its artisans had shown the world that the medium could shape the message, that how we write determines how we think. Papyrus had taught us continuity. Parchment taught us revision. The scroll unrolled forward. The codex invited return. Humanity learned to reread itself. And beneath that lesson, quieter still, was another. Endurance through transformation. The reed and the hide. The Nile and the mountain. Egypt and Anatolia. Each gave a chapter to the story of remembering. The parchment page, born of rivalry, became a bridge between civilizations, carrying the whispers of one into the language of another. The parchment carried stories farther than its makers could have dreamed. In time, its whitened surface became the stage upon which Europe, Asia, and the Middle East performed the drama of knowledge. Scrolls gave way to folded choirs, to stitched gatherings bound between wooden covers. What began as an answer to scarcity grew into a new rhythm of thought, the slow page-by-page turning that still governs how we read. When a scribe in Pergamon or Antioch or Rome opened a sheet of parchment, he entered a meditation. The knife that had scraped the hide was the first pen. The line between flesh and word was as thin as breath. The scent of lime and chalk lingered in the workshop, mingling with the resin smoke of lamps. Across the bench, another scribe whispered a prayer for steadiness before beginning a day's work. They copied not only scripture and law, but poems, letters, philosophies, fragments of dreams. Each letter drawn was an act of faith in continuity. The discipline of making and using parchment changed the shape of the scholar's life. The material was costly. No word could be wasted. Students learned to write small, precise hands, Greek uncials, Roman capitals, each curve calculated to conserve space and elegance. Mistakes were scraped away with pumice, leaving faint scars on the page like healed wounds. Some of those erased layers would later reveal palimpsests, hidden texts sleeping beneath newer ones, ghost conversations between centuries. In the faint overlap of ink, you can feel the hum of history correcting itself. A sermon overwrites a pagan poem. A scientific treatise hides beneath a prayer. And yet both endure. Parchment refused to forget completely. It remembered even its erasures. Monks in later ages would marvel at its strength. In damp cloisters where papyrus would rot within weeks, parchment endured for centuries. They saw this resilience as divine favor. When they bound the Gospels, they chose the finest calf skin, vellum, white and translucent, soft as breath. The words of God required pages that could last as long as faith. Thus the sacred and the secular, born from the rivalry of kings, reconciled on the same skin. Galen's influence persisted. His medical texts, copied on parchment, traveled from Pergamon to Rome, from Rome to Baghdad, from Baghdad to Paris. Physicians in every era touched those same diagrams of veins and organs, tracing the lines with fingers that had healed other bodies. Each copy was a pulse renewed. When scholars in the Renaissance rediscovered Galen's writings, they found them still breathing under the weight of time, the ink dark and steady. The parchment revolution was more than technical. It changed how people imagined memory. A scroll could hold only one continuous text. A codex could gather many. Knowledge began to cluster, to cross-reference, to argue with itself. Margins widened for commentary. Notes bred notes. Reading became dialogue rather than procession. The library evolved from a horde of rolls into a choir of bound voices, each singing in its own register. In Pergamon's ateliers, illuminators began to decorate initials with lapis blue and gold leaf. Light returned to the page, not from fire, but from artistry. The shimmer of gold recalled the sun of Anatolia. The cool blue mirrored its evening sky. When a reader opened such a book, he felt the horizon unfold in his hands. The parchment became a landscape where ink could walk. The Empire of Rome adopted this form eagerly. Bureaucrats valued its durability. Soldiers carried codices as field manuals. Lawyers archived decrees that would outlast the emperors who signed them. In the 2nd century, the codex began to replace the scroll entirely. Pliny's successors praised its convenience. Merchants marveled at its compactness. The word volume, once meaning a thing rolled, now meant a bound unity. Even language bent to accommodate the new material. Still, Pergamon's name clung to the process. In every language that inherited it, Latin pergamena, French parchemin, English parchment, the city lives on, whispering through etymology that the medium matters. Each time we touch a page, we touch Pergamon. The craft spread with the roads of empire. In Cappadocia and Syria, tanners learned to prepare goat and sheep skins for scholars and priests. In Rome's libraries, shelves creaked under the weight of codices wrapped in leather. In Alexandria, rebuilt and restless, the descendants of papyrus scribes now copied on hides imported from the north, the circle closing like a drawn breath. By the 3rd century CE, parchment had become the common skin of knowledge. The Christian communities, persecuted yet prolific, found in it a resilience that matched their faith. They carried codices in secret, their gospels compact enough to hide under cloaks. When read aloud in catacombs by lamplight, the white pages glowed like small dawns. Out of this marriage of material and message, grew the idea of the book as sacred object, a portable sanctuary of words. Meanwhile, in Pergamon itself, the great library began to fade. The Attalid dynasty was gone. Rome ruled the city as a provincial capital. Earthquakes cracked its terraces, wars drained its wealth. But even as its stones crumbled, its invention traveled outward. The true monument of Pergamon was not the marble altar or the shelves of scrolls, but the technology that survived them, the skin that remembered. Imagine one of those parchment workshops near the city gates. The morning light falls through lattice windows onto rows of stretched hides. Apprentices move quietly, turning frames, scraping with half-moon blades. The rhythm is soft, hypnotic. Dust drifts in the beams of light like powdered time. From the courtyard beyond comes the sound of a donkey's bell, a reminder that life outside continues as always. Inside, the hides tighten slowly, singing a faint hum when plucked. The master runs his hand over a finished sheet and nods. Its surface is smooth as calm water. In that instant, the distance between craft and devotion disappears. For the people of Pergamon, writing was not just the act of placing marks on a surface. It was the transformation of matter into meaning. Each sheet was proof that patience could conquer decay. Where papyrus depended on climate, parchment depended on care. It could survive flood and flame, if tended. That tenderness became its religion. Centuries later, when medieval monks copied Aristotle or Augustine, they unknowingly practiced Pergamon's ritual. When Renaissance printers sought models for their pages, they imitated the spacing and texture of parchment. Even modern paper, though cheap and perishable, still tries to mimic its warmth, its slight translucence, its whisper, under the hand. The ghost of Pergamon never stopped guiding the fingers of humanity. To read from parchment is to feel time in the fingertips. The surface resists slightly, reminding the reader that thought leaves traces on the world. Every creak of the binding, every smell of age, connects the living to the dead through touch. In a digital age, that intimacy is rare, but memory hungers for it still. Perhaps that is why ancient manuscripts draw such reverence. They are the closest we come to holding history's breath. By the late Roman era, libraries filled with codices bound in wooden boards covered by dyed leather, purple, red, and green. Titles were stamped in gold. Within these bindings slept the philosophies of Plato, the histories of Herodotus, the Gospels of Mark and John. The scroll had given humanity continuity. The codex gave it coherence. Knowledge could now be indexed, cited, and carried from place to place. The scholar no longer unrolled the past. He conversed with it. The change rippled quietly through language and art. Painters began to depict philosophers holding bound books instead of scrolls, saints reading from codices instead of rolls of papyrus. Even divine revelation adopted the new shape. The eternal now fit between covers. And somewhere in the silence of a scriptorium, a scribe paused to stretch his hand, looked at the page before him, and smiled. The parchment glowed softly under the lamplight. Outside, rain tapped on the stone roof. He dipped his quill, drew the next letter, and thought, perhaps without words, that the world had found a way to endure itself. The centuries after Pergamon blurred the boundaries between empire and monastery, between scholar and monk. The city's invention outlived its walls. Across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, the making of parchment became a sacred choreography, passed from hand to hand. Every monastery had its tannery, every abbey its scriptorium. In those cool rooms where daylight pooled like water through narrow windows, monks bent over pages with the same devotion once found in the halls of Athena's temple. They no longer called themselves scribes of kings, but servants of eternity. The hide stretched on wooden frames became altars, the knives, their instruments of prayer. They whispered psalms as they worked, blessing each sheet before setting ink to it. The noise of blades and the murmuring of Latin blended into one slow, patient hymn. When the finished pages were gathered and bound, the codex had a weight different from any scroll before it. To hold it was to cradle a small universe. Each turn of a leaf was a heartbeat. The parchment creaked like the sound of breath returning. No wonder the ancients said that books are alive. Out of these bound volumes, civilization rebuilt itself. The fall of Rome scattered its knowledge, but parchment preserved enough to plant new seeds. In Ireland and Italy, illuminated manuscripts glowed with color through centuries of darkness. In Baghdad, translators copied Greek and Latin texts onto goatskin, giving Aristotle and Galen new Arabic voices. Across the Mediterranean, the parchment page became the meeting ground of faiths. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all trusted it to carry their sacred words. If papyrus had been Egypt's gift to humanity, parchment was humanity's promise back to the divine. We will not forget. Everywhere it traveled, the parchment absorbed the accents of its keepers. In Constantinople, pages bore geometric ornaments of Byzantine gold. In Damascus, they shimmered with Kufic script. In the abbeys of France, they curled slightly at the edges, smelling faintly of wax and smoke. Time changed their color from cream to amber to the warm brown of old honey. They aged like skin because they were skin. The endurance of parchment is a quiet miracle. A single codex can outlive earthquakes, wars, and neglect. Buried manuscripts have been found intact after 1,000 years, the ink still legible, the colors still vibrant. It resists both mold and memory's erosion. The oldest complete Bible, the Codex Sinaiticus, written on parchment in the 4th century CE, still breathes its letters today in controlled light. Every page is a whisper from the age of Constantine, but even endurance carries melancholy. To turn such pages is to feel the centuries pressing close, reminding the reader of all that has vanished. Between the lines lies a silence filled with absent voices, the copyists whose names were never written, the animals whose skins gave form to language, the civilizations that shaped and lost their dreams. Parchment remembers them all, not with precision, but with presence. There is something humanly perfect about its imperfections. Unlike the smooth neutrality of paper, parchment bears texture, pores, tiny scars. Each sheet is unique. Some corners are rough where the knife slipped. Some letters faint where the surface absorbed too much ink. Reading across them is like tracing fingerprints of time. The flaws make the memory real. In the Renaissance, when printing pressed letters into paper, parchment seemed destined to fade. It was too slow, too expensive. Yet printers still bound their finest editions in vellum, honoring the lineage of the craft. The first printed Bibles echoed the feel of the handwritten ones. Gutenberg's press reproduced not only the words, but the cadence of the scribe. The ghost of Pergamon guided even the machines that replaced its children. Today, in climate-controlled archives, the ancient pages rest under glass. Scholars lean over them in silence, eyes magnified by lenses, hearts slowed by reverence. The room smells faintly of dust and memory. The parchment, when touched with gloved hands, makes a sound like distant rain. It is not fragile. It is simply patient. Sometimes the scientists who preserve these relics test their DNA. They find traces of goat, calf, sheep. species long extinct in their original forms. From their fibers, they reconstruct trade routes, climates, even epidemics. The parchment becomes a witness not only to thought, but to life itself. It is an archive of the planet as much as of the mind. What would the artisans of Pergamon think, seeing their invention studied under electron microscopes? Perhaps they would smile at the irony that the skin they once prepared by moonlight now reveals the story of the earth. Perhaps they would recognize in our technology the same impulse that moved their knives, the will to understand, to connect, to preserve. The truth is that we have never stopped living in Pergamon's dream. Every notebook, every screen, every cloud server is an echo of its creed. That memory must be made tangible. We still stretch our thoughts across frames, still scrape away errors, still polish the surface of the present until it gleams enough to hold meaning. The tools have changed, but the rhythm remains. Humanity writes, the world listens. At night, in the museums where the goddesses sleep, the temperature dips slightly. The air hums with machines keeping the humidity constant. Somewhere, a guard walks by, his flashlight tracing slow arcs across locked glass. For a moment, the beam catches the curve of an old vellum page. It gleams faintly, as if breathing. In that reflection lives the quiet covenant between then and now. The understanding that to remember is to honor, and to honor is to continue. Perhaps that is why parchment still moves us. It embodies the fragile balance of strength and surrender. It is both durable and perishable, both skin and spirit. When we look at it, we see ourselves, mortal matter carrying immortal thought. If you listen closely, you might still hear the workshop of Pergamon, the scraping of blades, the whisper of chalk, the sigh of wind through the stretched hides. You might hear the scholars murmuring in the library above, debating truth beneath Athena's gaze. The sound fades, returns, fades again, an old pulse hidden under the static of modern life. And if, one evening, you open an ancient book and the page glows softly in the lamplight, remember that what you hold is not merely history, but the body of memory itself. The parchment was once alive, and through it, so are you. It carries not just words, but the echo of hands, the warmth of breath, the faith of those who believed that thought deserved a second life. The skins of countless creatures transformed by human care have become a single organism, the great living archive of our species. From papyrus to parchment, from scroll to codex, from stone to cloud, the journey is the same, a movement toward endurance, a search for form worthy of the soul's weight. The reed gave us continuity, the hide gave us resilience. Together, they taught us that knowledge survives only when tenderness and discipline meet. And somewhere, far above the ruins of Pergamon, the wind still hums across the hill where the library once stood. The stars look down, indifferent yet luminous, as they did when Galen was a boy. The earth remembers even when we forget. In the hush between breaths, the parchment whispers its final lesson. Endure softly. The empire that inherited parchment also inherited restlessness. Rome did not invent libraries, but it perfected their grandeur. What the Egyptians began in papyrus and the Greeks refined in philosophy, the Romans built into stone. They believed that knowledge, like power, should have an address. Marble halls echoing with footsteps, bronze doors that swung open to citizens, mosaics that shimmered beneath lamplight. In Rome, even memory became architecture. It started modestly. In the late Republic, senators and scholars gathered scrolls as trophies from conquered lands. Generals returned from Greece with shiploads of manuscripts alongside statues and slaves. Cicero wrote of arranging his books as soldiers on parade, believing that order of mind mirrored order of state. His villa in Tusculum had a library facing east so the morning sun would fall upon the shelves. To read there was to feel civilized, to stand against the chaos beyond the borders. Then came Augustus, the first emperor, the organizer of the world. He inherited not just Rome, but the responsibility to make it permanent. Under his rule, public libraries became instruments of empire. He built two, one in the portico of Octavia, another in the temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill. They stood like twin lungs, breathing literacy into the capital. In these rooms, Greek and Latin scrolls were kept on opposite sides, a gesture both practical and symbolic. The dialogue between conqueror and conquered preserved as harmony rather than conflict. Visitors entered through bronze doors into a courtyard cooled by fountains. Shelves of cedar rose to the ceiling, each labeled with ivory tags. Between them stood busts of authors, Virgil, Homer, Demosthenes, arranged as if attending an eternal symposium. Light filtered through lattice windows, striking the gold of the wall inscriptions. Publica Bibliotheca, a library for the people, though few could truly read. But presence mattered. The empire announced itself not only through legions and aqueducts, but through literacy displayed like art. The librarians were freedmen, educated slaves entrusted with the empire's soul. They cataloged thousands of scrolls, repaired damaged ones, and guided readers through the maze of knowledge. Their silence was ceremonial, their gestures precise. To misplace a scroll was to misplace memory itself. In their careful movements, one sees the continuation of Alexandria's discipline, now draped in togas and law. As the empire expanded, so did its thirst for order. Governors established archives in provincial capitals. Military camps kept records of rations, ranks, and correspondence. Every decree, every census, every tax register found its way onto parchment or papyrus. The Romans understood that control depended on writing. Roads and ink were twin veins of administration. To govern without documentation was to rule in sand. Yet amid bureaucracy, there was still wonder. Scholars gathered in Rome from every corner of the empire. Egyptian mathematicians, Syrian astronomers, Greek physicians. The city's libraries became melting pots of languages and ideas. In the 1st century CE, Pliny the Elder compiled his natural history, a 37-book encyclopedia that sought to describe everything known to man, from stars to stones to bees. He died studying the eruption of Vesuvius, notebook in hand, proving that curiosity can be as fatal as heroism. His work survived because scribes recopied it endlessly on parchment. The empire's nervous system of knowledge still pulsing long after his lungs had filled with ash. Trajan, the builder emperor, raised the most splendid library of them all beside his forum around 112 CE. Two grand halls faced each other, one for Latin texts, one for Greek. Between them rose Trajan's column, its spiral carvings narrating the conquest of Dacia. Inside, clerks and scholars moved in quiet symmetry. The smell of parchment mixed with that of incense and polished bronze. Light from the clear story caught the gilt edges of shelves. It was a theater of learning, a civic cathedral where silence replaced prayer. To stand there was to feel the empire think. Every inscription, every scroll, every measured line of architecture echoed Rome's conviction that knowledge was not rebellion, but obedience to order. In a world of armies and laws, the library offered structure without violence. Its columns held up the idea that reason itself was imperial, but the library also sheltered dissent. In its corners, philosophers whispered doubts about fate and power. Stoics argued that virtue mattered more than rank. Epicureans claimed that pleasure, not conquest, defined happiness. The emperors tolerated such debates as long as they remained within marble walls. Beyond them, heresy was treason. Yet even tyranny needs thinkers. Rome's rulers consulted astrologers, historians, engineers, scribes who could turn thought into infrastructure. The aqueduct and the library were siblings, both carrying clarity where once there was thirst. Within private homes, miniature libraries multiplied. Wealthy Romans displayed shelves of parchment, not merely to read, but to signify cultivation. Scrolls lined atriums beside busts of ancestors. The educated elite recited poetry aloud at banquets, the cadence of Latin verse mingling with the clatter of cups. Reading was still a performance. The silent, solitary reader was rare. To open a scroll before guests was to demonstrate command over civilization's symbols, as others might display jewels or land. Meanwhile, in the provinces, smaller libraries appeared. At Ephesus, at Timgad, at Nisa. The Library of Celsus in Ephesus, built in the 2nd century, still stands today in ruin but dignity. Its facade, a blend of Greek grace and Roman precision, rises in tiers of columns and statues representing wisdom, knowledge, and virtue. Inside once stood 2 stories of niches filled with scrolls, their contents now long gone. Yet even empty, the structure continues to speak. Sunlight through its broken windows still casts the shadows of words. The Romans believed architecture could outlast the fragile breath of papyrus. They were partly right. Stone endures. Ideas need guardians. The empire's grandeur preserved texts, but also ossified them. Copying became mechanical, reverent rather than creative. Scholarship turned into commentary on commentary. The living spark of curiosity cooled into marble respect. Still, not all minds slept. In the 2nd century, Claudius Ptolemy, working in Alexandria under Roman rule, composed his Almagest, mapping the heavens with mathematical elegance. In Pergamon's descendant libraries, Galen dissected knowledge as precisely as flesh. These thinkers proved that even under empire, thought could remain audacious. The parchment page, supple and waiting, continued to receive both obedience and rebellion. As centuries passed, the empire's weight pressed harder upon itself. Fires consumed scrolls, invasions scattered scholars. In 192 CE, the Temple of Peace, which housed one of Rome's largest libraries, burned. Later emperors rebuilt, but the cycle of flame and reconstruction began to feel ritualistic, as if the empire were rehearsing its own demise. Each rebuilding was an act of faith against the inevitable. By the 4th century, Christianity had risen from persecution to power. The new faith brought both destruction and preservation. Pagan temples were closed, but their libraries were sometimes spared, absorbed into church property. Bishops became the new curators of wisdom. They copied scripture with the same devotion once given to Homer. The Word replaced the world as the central text. In the villas of North Africa and Gaul, aristocrats like Cassiodorus and Symmachus maintained private collections, bridging pagan eloquence and Christian piety. When barbarian tribes crossed the frontiers, many of these libraries vanished overnight, burned with the houses that held them. But some scrolls traveled east, carried by monks to safer shores. Others were hidden in cellars and forgotten until dust became their guardian. The empire, that vast library of roads and laws, began to collapse. Yet the instinct to preserve did not die. In the twilight of Roman order, monks in distant monasteries gathered the remnants. They copied Virgil beside the Gospels, Cicero beside Augustine, believing that all language could serve praise. On the same parchment that once bore decrees of emperors, they inscribed prayers. The transformation was seamless. Authority had changed its vocabulary, but kept its handwriting. Thus Rome, in falling, gave birth to continuity. Its libraries, shattered and scattered, seeded the cloisters that would become Europe's memory. The marble sanctuaries turned into stone cells. The public scriptorium became the monk's wooden desk. The empire of conquest became an empire of preservation. Somewhere in the ruins of the Forum, a single parchment fragment may still lie buried under centuries of dust. A scrap of law, a verse of poetry, a grocery list from a senator's kitchen. It does not matter what is written upon it. Its existence is enough. The act of writing, of keeping, of hoping that someone might one day read, is the quietest form of rebellion against decay. As Rome aged, its libraries grew quieter. The voices of empire softened into echoes among marble corridors. Once they had been symbols of triumph. Now they were sanctuaries of survival. A clerk's quill replaced the sword as the empire's final defense against oblivion. The soldiers guarded borders, the scribes guarded time. Within the city, scholars like Aulus Gellius and Macrobius turned learning inward, weaving anthologies that preserved the wit and fragments of older authors. They became curators of ghosts, piecing together culture from memory and quotation. When the empire ceased to expand outward, it expanded backward, digging into its own past for meaning. In the quiet of libraries, Rome began reading itself. Those who sought refuge there did so not for wealth or status, but for stillness. The scrolls offered a different kind of power, one that did not command, but contemplated. A philosopher could sit among the shelves and feel the empire shrink to the width of a page. Outside, the world crumbled. Inside, sentences held their line. By the 3rd century, the imperial bureaucracy had multiplied beyond control. Scribes filled entire wings of buildings known as tabularia, where parchment records of taxes and decrees were stacked in careful disorder. The ink smell mingled with wax from seals, creating an aroma that later generations would associate with both law and fatigue. Bureaucracy was the empire's new theology. The gods of paperwork demanded constant sacrifice, time, patience, attention. Yet even bureaucracy preserves what poetry might lose. From these archives, we still know the names of forgotten clerks, their signatures trembling on crumbling pages. Their handwriting is humble, almost apologetic, but enduring. They were not philosophers or poets, but they too built the bridge between the living and the remembered. In the outer provinces, small libraries continued to glow like candles. In North Africa, Carthage housed schools of rhetoric that trained men like Augustine, who would later turn the language of empire into the language of prayer. His confessions read like a library speaking to itself, the scholar becoming the soul, the parchment turning to heart. The transition from Roman to Christian library was not abrupt. It was a slow exhalation. For a time, both worlds coexisted. In the great baths of Caracalla, libraries stood beside gyms and gardens, a union of body and mind. Citizens read while others exercised, the rustle of pages mingling with the splash of fountains. It was civilization in balance, thought and flesh sharing the same space. But balance is brief. The invasions came like storms from the north and east. Goths, Vandals, Huns, each wave tearing pages from the book of the world. Libraries burned not from neglect, but from hunger. Shelves became firewood, parchment bindings stripped for clothing. A single codex could feed a fire long enough to cook a meal. The empire's learning, once the pride of marble halls, was reduced to smoke. Still, memory is a stubborn thing. Even as libraries fell, their contents migrated. Scholars fled to Constantinople, carrying bundles of scrolls. Others retreated into monasteries perched on remote hills. There, amid stone walls and cold light, they unrolled what remained of Virgil, Livy, Cicero. They copied until their hands cramped and their candles died. They did not think of themselves as saving civilization. They were simply praying with ink. In those monasteries, the Roman sense of order found new life. Each scriptorium followed a rhythm of hours, matins, lauds, prime, tierce. Between prayers, the monks wrote. The sound of quills scratching across parchment became as regular as breathing. They developed abbreviations to save time, illuminations to praise beauty, margins wide enough for future readers to add their thoughts. Every page became a collaboration across centuries. If the library of Alexandria had sought to gather all knowledge, the monastic library sought to keep a little flame alive. It did not need to know everything, only enough to rekindle the world later. This humility proved stronger than empire. Among these monks were heirs of Roman discipline. Cassiodorus, once a statesman under the Gothic king Theodoric, retired to found the vivarium, a community where copying manuscripts was an act of devotion. He ordered that scripture and classical works alike be preserved, writing, "Let those who wish to be free from the snares of sloth occupy themselves with sacred reading." His words turned study into labor, labor into prayer. Through such labor, the Roman mind did not die. It simply changed its posture, from the upright stance of conquerors to the bowed head of scribes. The empire's power of administration became the church's power of preservation. Where emperors once built libraries to display dominion, monks built them to shield light. Outside, ruins multiplied. The forum became pasture. The Colosseum turned into quarry. But within the cloisters, sentences continued to bloom. The library shrank in size but grew in intensity. Each manuscript copied was a heartbeat against the silence creeping from the edges of the map. Consider a single monk, hunched at his desk in the 6th century. The room is cold, lit by one oil lamp. His parchment is scraped smooth, his quill cut from a goose feather. On the page before him, he traces letters older than his tongue. Perhaps he does not understand all that he copies, yet he feels their weight. The empire that wrote them is gone, but its words remain, trembling slightly in the flicker of flame. His hand pauses. He looks out the narrow window. Snow falls on the ruins of what was once Rome. He exhales, dips his quill, and writes again. The line he copies might be Virgil or a psalm. It hardly matters. What matters is that the act continues, the transmission of breath from one century to the next. In this quiet persistence lies the true library of Rome, not the marble buildings or bronze doors, but the habit of care, the belief that thought deserves continuity. The scribes were the empire's afterlife, its reincarnation in humility, and yet fragments of grandeur persisted. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire kept libraries alive on an imperial scale. The Great Imperial Library, founded by Constantius II and later expanded by Julian, held tens of thousands of manuscripts. Greek fire guarded its coasts. Greek ink guarded its memory. While the West darkened, the East remained luminous, preserving Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen until the world was ready to read them again. The Byzantine scribes inherited both the precision of Rome and the mysticism of the East. Their manuscripts gleamed with gold leaf, their letters rounded like domes. Reading them today, one senses a civilization both weary and serene, a Rome transfigured by faith. The empire's body had died, but its mind knelt in prayer. By the time barbarian kings ruled Italy, the libraries of Rome were legends. Travelers spoke of underground vaults filled with scrolls untouched since the Caesars. Some fragments survived in the hands of scholars like Boethius, who tried to reconcile Plato with Christianity before his execution. His final work, The Consolation of Philosophy, written in prison on reused parchment, became the bridge between the ancient and the medieval mind. Even at the empire's end, a Roman was still writing to comfort himself with wisdom. The last libraries of the West decayed quietly. Roofs collapsed, rain smudged ink, ivy climbed over forgotten shelves. But in Constantinople, scribes kept copying. In Syria, scholars of Edessa translated Aristotle into Syriac. In Alexandria, again resurrected, Christian and Jewish scholars debated scripture under the echo of the old Mouseion. The dream persisted, changing names, changing gods, but never changing its pulse. Rome's sanctuaries of learning did not fall. They dissolved into memory, flowing into new vessels. Every monastery, every cathedral school, every illuminated page was a fragment of the empire reborn. The marble cracked, but the idea endured, that the written word is the surest architecture. When people speak of the fall of Rome, they often imagine sudden ruin, the walls collapsing, the legions fleeing, the torch of civilization extinguished overnight. But the truth is slower, gentler, almost tender. Empires do not die as men do. They fade, their breath becoming wind. And within that wind, something endures. Rome's libraries did not vanish. They exhaled. Their scrolls became seeds carried by monks, merchants, and wanderers across mountains and seas. The empire that once conquered the world by force now conquered it by remembrance. The parchment pages of Virgil and Aristotle, Augustine and Galen, drifted like pollen, planting the Roman mind wherever hands were willing to copy. The monasteries became the lungs of this quiet resurrection. Monte Cassino, founded by Benedict in the 6th century, pulsed with the rhythm of prayer and pen. Its scribes worked to the steady beat of bells, each stroke of ink a response to the divine. On their shelves, Roman law slept beside sacred psalms. The empire had not been replaced. It had been transfigured into liturgy. In the scriptoria of Ireland and Gaul, the Roman alphabet blossomed in new colors. Celtic monks wove it into spirals and knots, filling margins with beasts and vines that curled like living vines around Latin letters. The Book of Kells, shimmering with gold, turned scripture into art, and art into remembrance. The parchment, made from calf skin, seemed to glow from within, as if the soul of the empire itself had been illuminated. Even as Europe fragmented, the idea of the library as a sacred place persisted. Every monastery became a Rome in miniature, cloisters echoing with footsteps, shelves lined with bound parchment, the smell of ink mingled with incense. To read was to pray, to copy was to resurrect. The marble grandeur was gone, but its echo now lived in candlelight and silence. In the East, Constantinople remained a living archive. Scholars there maintained not only Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian, but also Greek philosophy, medicine, and mathematics. The city's libraries, protected by thick walls and divine hubris, outlasted plague and siege for 1,000 years. They were the hinge of continuity, preserving the wisdom that would later awaken Europe from its slumber. When the city finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, refugees carried manuscripts westward, their bundles of parchment heavier than gold. That migration lit the spark of the Renaissance. The empire's last breath became humanity's new dawn. Thus Rome, even in death, gave birth again. Its ashes fertilized Florence, Venice, Paris, cities where knowledge once more found stone and light. Printers set Latin words in metal, echoing the curves of letters once traced by monks. Paper replaced parchment, but the lineage was clear. Every printed page was a descendant of a Roman decree. Every library a reincarnation of the Palatine halls. The Roman sense of order shaped even how we think about knowledge. The catalog, the archive, the library building, each owes its structure to Roman architecture and law. The shelves mirror colonnades, the index mirrors bureaucracy. The book itself, bound and numbered, mirrors the Roman obsession with hierarchy. When we say a library system, we still speak Latin unconsciously. And yet, beneath the system, there lingers something softer, the Roman understanding that memory must be embodied. For the Romans, words carved in stone or written on skin were not metaphors. They were extensions of the body politic. The empire's flesh became parchment. Its bones became marble. Every monument and manuscript shared the same desire, to resist time by taking form. Perhaps that is why Roman libraries continue to haunt our imagination. We picture them not as ruins, but as presences. The smell of warm dust, the creak of wood under sandals, the murmur of voices reading aloud. In that sensory memory lies the truest survival. The body of Rome has dissolved, but its gestures remain. The turning of a page, the measuring of light across a desk. The instinct to arrange knowledge into harmony. Sometimes, in the ruins of ancient forums, archaeologists find charred bits of papyrus fused to clay tablets. The words are mostly lost, but the shapes of the letters remain, shadows pressed into ash. It is enough to know that someone once wrote there. That thought passed through human hands into permanence. The parchment may crumble, but the gesture endures. All civilizations come to understand this, that memory is the gentlest defiance. The Empire of Rome, for all its armies and laws, is gone, yet its libraries still breathe in us. Each time we cite a text, record a law, preserve a story, we repeat their act of quiet rebellion against forgetting. The true Pax Romana was never enforced by swords, but by sentences. Picture the end of a Roman day. The city hums softly, the baths emptied, the lamps lit along marble streets. In a library near the Palatine Hill, a librarian closes the bronze doors. He pauses, hearing the echo of his footsteps on mosaic floors. Outside, the air smells of rain and smoke. Inside, the shelves hold their breath. He places a hand on one scroll, perhaps a volume of Lucretius or Livy, and feels the faint warmth left by his touch. He cannot know that centuries from now, his gesture will be repeated by hands speaking new tongues. He only knows that the words will sleep safely tonight. Beyond the city walls, darkness gathers over the fields. Owls cry among the ruins of aqueducts. But in the library, a single lamp remains burning. Its flame trembles, reflected in a bronze mirror beside the desk. The librarian adjusts the wick, then sits for a moment longer, listening to the silence that is not silence, the rustle of parchment, the slow settling of air between shelves. He breathes, and the library breathes with him. That breath is the empire's true legacy. Not conquest or marble, but the rhythm of attention, the human refusal to let thought vanish. It passes now through our own quiet rooms, through digital screens glowing in the night, through the hum of modern archives. The empire is gone, yet its habit remains, to write, to read, to care. And so, in the long continuum from papyrus to parchment to pixel, the Roman sanctuary of knowledge lives on. Every time a library light flickers on after dark, every time a reader bends over a page, every time a sentence crosses centuries to find a listener, it is Rome again, serene and watchful, holding the world together, not with power, but with words. The lamp in the library burns low. Outside, dawn waits beyond the Tiber. The librarian rises, closes the shutters, and whispers the same prayer that is carried through millennia. May memory endure. The candles have burned low, and the scrolls are asleep again. Somewhere, under layers of dust and centuries, a single page still whispers, reminding us that memory is the most human form of eternity. Thank you for walking these silent corridors with me tonight. More forgotten wonders are waiting in the dark, ready to be read by the light of your curiosity. Until next time, rest well, dream deep, and may the library of your mind stay forever open.